I think recently there's been a lot of talk about private equity, venture capital, sort of fundraising in South Africa in terms of the climate. I mean, just give us an idea on the difference between the two, between VC and private equity.
Maybe let's start with a similarity. Both are investment partnerships where you invest in and manage a company before eventually potentially selling it, hopefully making some money in the process. Private equity tends to target existing businesses with profitable track records and established management teams to partner with, whereas venture capital is more focused on startups, businesses that are earlier in their life cycle. And I think perhaps the other point worth noting is, why do we do equity investments? I think there's a number of reasons. I suppose the most obvious is to strengthen the balance sheet so that you can grow. The other is to buy out founders or other shareholders that want to exit. The other is to facilitate Black economic empowerment or to bring in second-tier management. But all of those are typically done with a private equity mindset. Venture capital, you're obviously typically taking more risk, and because you're getting in earlier, you are probably not paying the sort of multiples that a private equity investor would be paying. Private equity is at a point in the life cycle where, because it's got a proven track record, your growth has probably slowed a little, but there's still good growth prospects. But your downside is probably lower, but you pay for that. So with the sort of backdrop of what private equity is, how does Corvest do private equity? How would we sort of differentiate ourselves from our competition?
Private equity is very much, I still say it's more of an art form than a science. And it really is about alignment and relationships. So if you look at a lot of what we've done in the past, it's all about partnerships. And I think Corvest is renowned for that. Building kind of partnerships will always lead to a successful outcome in the end. So for us, yes, the sector is important, the company is important. But if we can get that management piece right, where we get proper alignment, we've got competent management, they're properly incentivized. I think if there's trust between the parties and they understand exactly what we need and what they need, that to us is a winning formula rather than just the rands and cents. Really, it's all about the trust. We get that trust. We understand what each party needs over 5 years, 10 years, even 20 years for that matter. That really, to me, makes a big difference. So, Jen, I mean, just looking at the latest SAFCA sort of news coming out, and that was from the last sort of survey that they did. I think they talked about 23, the latter half of 23, being a really good or positive outlook. I mean, how do you match that to Corvest outlook and your thoughts in that regard?
It's interesting that there is certainly an increase in bullishness around the latter half of this year. And I suppose it coincides with slightly less opaque economic forecast conditions and potentially better news from a load shedding perspective, government policy perspective. And if all of those things pan out correctly, I think they're right. I think certainly if we look at our acquisition opportunities, we've got a healthy pipeline of opportunities we're looking at. Having said that, I think the ability to exit is still difficult. And I don't see that improving dramatically this year. I think we need inflation to come down more. I think we need more clarity on market conditions. Ideally, we need the forthcoming elections out the way. We just need a little bit more better understanding of what the market's doing before opportunities to exit improve. I think right now, the secondary buyout market is largely non-existent. I think players are sort of sitting on the fence and waiting for conditions to improve. I think there's still quite a large price gap, expectations price gap, which I think will only close once there's better clarity. I think right now, as buyers, you are trying to price in the opaqueness in the market, and the seller is trying to convince the buyer that it's temporary. And therein lies the difficulty.
So we're probably looking at a Q2 next year to get more clarity.
Absolutely.
Sure. I agree with that.
Mike, Corvest has quite a proud track record in the services sector, sort of outsourced services space. Where do you think that comes from, and why has that developed that way, given we're actually generally quite agnostic in terms of investment industries?
So yeah, I mean, again, I mean, it's also hard to answer because, Corvest has been going for so long, over 35, 36 years. So I guess some of it is success breeds success. I think we started in the early days on small acquisitions, and in those days, services businesses were typically that. It was a sort of family-run business with a couple of workers, and from there it kind of developed into bigger organizations as you have today. But I think a lot of it also is predictability. So services businesses by their nature are very predictable. It's annuity type income. Every month you've got debit order runs. You can actually predict your outrun for the year quite easily. And I think South Africa, by the nature of, we've got a large sort of labor force. You're not competing with offshore parties. Very difficult for offshore parties to come in from China, from the US, from Europe, and try compete with the labor force, with the South African labor force. Not easy. So from one, there's a barrier. There's a big moat around that kind of sector. And then I think lastly is probably the exchange rate. Again, it's not dependent on exchange rate, what happens internationally, or there's no commodity risk. You've got a labor that you've got set rates, again, predictable. And I think labor, it's challenging in this environment, but what we have got is a very well-established kind of labor law in South Africa. So I think with that in mind, exchange rates non-dependent. It doesn't impact the earnings of the service business in SA. And as I say, from a growth point of view, the annuity allows one to expand very quickly. So putting money into that sector, I think, is a really defensible side.
Mike, you mentioned the word defensive. Would you say that investing in services, or the services industry per se, is fairly defensive in economic cycles?
Absolutely. And we've seen it through COVID. We've seen, I think services are probably, in many corporates, is the last thing they're going to save. And in many instances, I think the amount that people go through these services companies is not dramatic. It's not going to move the needle, for instance, in a downturn, to suddenly drop all your services. You're not going to drop your cleaners. You're certainly not going to drop your guards. Your catering business. I mean, again, catering, what does catering bring to a corporate? It brings, obviously you're feeding your staff. You're getting the morale. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes into it. Now, to drop that and save a couple of cents in a big corporate's budget is not going to move the needle, and that's what we find. Whereas in the upside, the more staff you've got, the more growth, the more services. But there is a base. There's a base to where you can cut. It's a sector we love, and it's a sector we'll continue to play in. Jen, just looking again post-COVID, I mean, I think we're getting almost now back to kind of pre-2019 levels, and hopefully COVID's a thing of the past. The trends that we're seeing in the market at the moment, I mean, what is driving, certainly from our business, from a Corvest point of view, but what do you think is also driving the private equity landscape?
I think there's a number of things, Mike. Firstly, perhaps the difficulty we face is immigration and the impact that's having on a sort of a senior management capacity and pool of talent. We're finding it increasingly difficult to find senior management, and that in turn impacts the ability to exit. So you've got to think a lot more strategically and more long-term around management alignment, ensuring you've got a solid management that's there for long after our potential exit. Broad-based Black economic empowerment remains very much a key cornerstone of the investment market. And, we were an early adopter of BEE, and in fact, I think we've done well over 100 transactions to date. And that remains very much a core part of our business. And although rules and legislation are changing all the time, I think we make it our business to stay abreast of that legislation, and constantly look at new ways to invest, new ways to facilitate Black empowerment. I suppose the third trend we're seeing is ESG. I think I would say that globally, the private equity market is probably a bit ahead of us here in terms of ESG and that sort of style of investment. But it's becoming increasingly important for us. And I think the market is also realizing that private equity, because we're so intricately involved in the underlying businesses, and we sit on the boards and we take an active part in strategy development, etc., that we're actually well positioned to drive ESG, and that naturally we can have a hell of a lot more impact than a sort of a passive investor on the JSE could possibly have. Some of the uncertainty does create opportunity for us.
Okay, we're not new to uncertainty, and that's what That's what's driven the business model for so many years.
Absolutely. And, people are scared of high inflation, but high inflation doesn't actually hurt private equity.
Yeah.
You just want to know where to next. It's more the lack of clarity that does make life a little bit difficult. Mike, $1 million question. Why choose Corvest?
I think in summary, and again, if you want to be very brief about it, I think we're a long-term player. Private equity is a long-term game, and don't let anyone tell you it's a 5 to 7 year game, because it's not. So I think we've got deep industry knowledge. With a portfolio of 58 companies in our portfolio, I think we've earned the right to be able to call ourselves specialists. And partnership, as I said, and I harp on this point with the team. I harp on with our clients and anyone else who's interested. It's all about partnerships.